rescue. There's a boy in the water. Something's circling him.
Ma'am, stay calm. Can you confirm the location?
North end of Resurrection Bay. He's just past the rocks. Please, hurry.
We have visual on the dorsal fin, closing in fast.
Please! Please get to him in time!
Keep eyes on the boy! We're almost there!
Alaska Marine Rescue. What's your emergency? There's a boy in the water. Something's circling him. It's huge. I think it's a killer whale. Please, hurry. On a calm August afternoon in 2005, the waters of Resurrection Bay looked like a postcard until a 12-year-old boy's summer swim turned into a fight to stay alive. Locals and tourists watched in shock as a massive dorsal fin cut the surface, closing in fast. The rescue boat was racing to the scene, but in those frozen seconds, no one knew if they'd make it in time. What unfolded would not only shake the small town of Seward, but raise urgent questions about why one of the ocean's most powerful predators came so close to shore and to a child. Stick around to hear the full story, and if you care about real accounts of human encounters with the wild, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. It was August 2005, and Resurrection Bay, just outside the small fishing town of Seward, Alaska, wore the calm beauty of a northern summer. The deep blue water shimmered under the warm afternoon sun, each ripple catching streaks of gold, as if the sea itself was painted in light. Overhead, gulls glided effortlessly, their calls carried on a breeze that smelled faintly of salt and kelp. The shoreline was lined with dark, moss-covered rocks, where gentle waves broke in a rhythmic hush. 12-year-old Mason Carter had been waiting all summer for this trip. Visiting from Anchorage, he had begged his mom to bring him to the bay, a place he'd only heard about from his uncle's fishing stories. Now, standing barefoot at the edge of the cold, glassy water, he barely hesitated before plunging in with a handful of local kids. The shock of the chilly water made them squeal, then burst into laughter that echoed across the open cove. From her spot on the sun-bleached driftwood, Mason's mother, Rachel, watched with a quiet smile. She kept one hand over her eyes to block the glare, tracking her son's small frame as he splashed and swam alongside his friends. To her, the bay felt endless, a place where the horizon dissolved into the pale blue sky. It was the kind of afternoon she wished she could bottle, the kind where time slowed down and the worries of everyday life seemed to drift out to sea, out on the water. Mason felt like he was part of something bigger. The surface rocked gently beneath him, sunlight flickering like broken glass just below the waves. He swam farther from shore, chasing after the older boys, past the mossy rocks that marked the shallows. The water here was darker, cooler, the kind of depth that made your imagination wander. But Mason wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about how good the sun felt on his face and how free he felt in this wide, open space. The wind shifted without warning, carrying a deeper, colder scent from the far side of the bay. A low swell rolled in from beyond the mouth of the cove, lifting Mason and the others slightly before settling again. Rachel noticed the change too, lowering her hand for a moment, the sunlight reflecting sharply off the water into her eyes. Somewhere, farther out, the gulls' cries grew louder, more urgent. The moment passed quickly enough that no one thought twice about it. The laughter continued. The bay seemed the same, but just beneath that moving sheet of blue, something else was part of the afternoon now moving, watching, and drawing closer without a sound. The calm rhythm of the bay shattered in an instant. A powerful surge of water broke the surface with a deep, rushing sound. And from the depths, a massive black and white form shot upward. It was an adult killer whale, its sleek body glistening as it cut through the water with startling force. Mason barely had time to register the shape before it lunged toward him. A sharp, searing pain exploded through his arm and side as the water around him erupted in a spray of white foam. The world seemed to tilt. Mason's voice tore out in a short, panicked cry that was swallowed almost immediately by the wind and waves. His friends, stunned at first, snapped into motion, thrashing toward the shore with frantic strokes. Their shouts overlapped, a chaotic blend of fear and disbelief, mixing with the sudden crash of waves stirred up by the giant animal's movement. On shore, Linda Moretti had been watching from the rocky path above the beach. The moment she saw the dark dorsal fin cut the water near the boy, her breath caught in her throat. She stood frozen for a heartbeat, unable to believe what she was seeing. Then instinct took over. She pulled her cell phone from her jacket pocket and dialed the Alaskan Marine Rescue hotline, her voice trembling as she relayed what was happening. Out in the water, the killer whale didn't disappear. It circled with deliberate, measured movements, its glossy head breaking the surface just enough for its eyes to lock onto Mason. The water between them seemed to shrink, the quiet moments between each rise and dip of its body stretching longer than they should. Mason's legs kicked without rhythm now, his energy already fading. The sea, which had been calm minutes earlier, was now alive with movement. Rolling swells rose and fell in irregular patterns, pulling sunlight into shifting, jagged shapes on the surface. Each crest cast a shadow that merged with the predator's own, blotting out patches of gold and replacing them with something colder, heavier. From somewhere beyond the cove, the distant hum of an engine began to grow louder. The rescue boat was on its way, but the sound felt far off, almost separate from the urgency playing out in the water, on shore. Rachel Carter stood beside Linda now, gripping her own phone but unable to form words. Every instinct told her to run into the water, but the distance, the size of the animal, and the unknowns froze her to the spot. The boat's engine growled closer, cutting through the noise of the surf. Time felt strange, too fast and too slow all at once. Every eye on the shore was locked on the same point out in the bay, where a boy and a predator shared the same stretch of water, and where help was racing against the tide. The rescue boat cut through the water at full speed, its engine roaring against the wind. Spray flew up on either side of the bow as it closed the distance to the spot where Mason struggled. Two crew members, already suited in thick wetsuits and rescue harnesses, stood ready. The moment the boat slowed, they moved without hesitation, diving into the frigid bay with coils of lifeline rope slung over their shoulders. Mason's head bobbed weakly above the surface, his strokes uneven and slow. His arms trembled with exhaustion, and blood seeped from the deep gash on his arm, swirling into thin red trails that vanished in the dark water. His breathing came in short, uneven bursts, each one stolen by the cold. One rescuer approached from behind, careful not to startle him, and slipped the rope's loop under Mason's arms, securing it firmly across his chest. The other positioned himself between them and the killer whale, extending a long rescue pole tipped with a bright orange buoy. The animal remained near the surface, circling at a distance, its large dorsal fin cutting the water like a silent blade. For a tense moment, it lingered, its path deliberate, almost curious. Then, with a slow roll of its body, it slid beneath the surface and disappeared into the deep, leaving only a widening ripple. With the danger no longer immediate, the rescuer holding Mason signaled to the crew on the boat. The rope tightened, and within seconds, Mason was lifted from the water and pulled aboard. His wide eyes darted from face to face, his lips pale from the cold, each breath coming too fast, wrapped in a thermal blanket. He clutched the edge of the seat as if it were the only solid thing left in the world, back on shore. Linda Moretti still had her phone pressed to her ear, her voice unsteady as she recounted the details to the Coast Guard dispatcher. Her words were scattered, shifting between describing the attack and making sure they knew Mason was alive. The boat headed straight for the dock, its engine steady now, cutting through the small waves that had risen during the commotion. Mason's mother met them at the pier, running down the ramp before the boat had fully stopped. The rescuers guided her son into her arms, and together they moved quickly toward the waiting ambulance. That night, Mason was admitted to Seward Memorial Hospital. Doctors treated his wounds, but his body still shook from shock and cold. The staff kept him under close watch, knowing that physical injuries could heal faster than the fear now embedded in his memory. As word of the incident spread, one question hung in the air, whispered among locals, and echoed in official briefings: why had a wild killer whale, in the waters of Resurrection Bay turned on a child. The morning after the attack, the corridors of Seward Memorial Hospital were quiet except for the soft beeps of monitors and the occasional muffled voice of a nurse. James Holloway, a seasoned Marine investigator with the Alaska Coast Guard, walked in carrying a weathered leather folder tucked under his arm. He had seen many unusual cases in his career, but the thought of a killer whale injuring a child in these waters carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Dr. Ellen Parker, the hospital's forensic specialist, met him just outside Mason's room. Her expression was calm but serious. Inside, Mason lay propped up against a stack of pillows, a blanket pulled high over his chest. His mother sat beside him, holding his hand as the morning light filtered in through the blinds, under the sterile glow of the examination lamp. Dr. Parker began her careful inspection of Mason's injuries. The deep scratches and wide bruises on his arm and side told a story without words. She traced the curved impressions on his skin, noting how the pattern matched the jawline of an adult orca. Her pen scratched steadily across her clipboard as she documented each mark in detail. "It doesn't look like it was meant to kill him outright," she said quietly to James, mindful not to alarm Mason's mother. This kind of bite could be a test in animals sampling potential prey. The phrasing hung in the air, unsettling in its implication. James listened while glancing over his own notes. He had already begun pulling up incident records from the past decade, focusing on reports from Resurrection Bay and nearby waters. As the pages added up, a trend began to emerge: more and more sightings of orcas moving close to shore, some even interacting with fishing boats. It wasn't just random curiosity, it was a shift in behavior. Later that afternoon, James invited Dr. Harold Jensen, a respected marine biologist from Seward, to join the discussion. Jensen had been tracking salmon populations for years and was quick to point out the sharp decline in numbers that summer. "When the fish disappear," he explained, "predators start looking elsewhere. It's possible this orca mistook the boy for a seal or another small marine mammal." The observation fit the physical evidence, but it also pushed the conversation into uneasy territory. If the attack wasn't just an accident, it could be a sign of something much larger, an ecosystem under strain, forcing its top predators to adapt in ways that brought them dangerously close to humans. As James left the hospital that evening, the sky over Seward was painted in pale gold, the bay stretching out in stillness. But beneath that calm surface, he knew the answers they were chasing would reveal more than just the reason for one boy's injuries. They might be staring at the first hints of a deeper change in the relationship between people and the wild waters they lived beside. 4 days after the attack, Mason was finally steady enough to speak on camera. The interview was set up in a small corner of his hospital room, the blinds drawn halfway to soften the light. His mother, Rachel Carter, sat close beside him, her arm resting protectively along the back of his chair. The faint hum of medical equipment filled the pauses between breaths. Mason's voice was still shaky, the words coming slowly as if he were sorting through them in real time. "I was just swimming," he began, eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. "And then I saw this big shadow under me. At first I thought it was a log, but then I saw its eyes. It was looking straight at me, really close. I didn't even have time to think." Then he stopped, drawing in a breath, his fingers tightening around the blanket draped over his lap. "I felt this sharp pain in my arm and my side. I thought I was going to die right there." Rachel's eyes brimmed as she listened. She reached over and took Mason's hand, holding it tightly. "I could see it happening from the shore," she said softly, her voice unsteady. "I couldn't move. I couldn't get to him. I've never felt so powerless in my life." The interview was brief, but it didn't take long for Mason's account to ripple through Seward, in the harbor, on fishing boats, and in the small diners along the waterfront. People replayed his words. Many longtime residents admitted they had never heard of a direct attack by an orca in Resurrection Bay. Sightings, yes. Close encounters, sometimes, but nothing like this. While the story circulated through town, the investigation pressed on. James Holloway's team collected satellite imagery, water temperature data, and sonar readings from the days before the incident. They mapped the area where Mason had been swimming and compared it to known orca migration routes. They also analyzed underwater recordings from research buoys placed farther out in the bay. The sound signatures suggested a solitary male had been moving unusually close to shore in the week leading up to the attack. Every new piece of information made it harder to dismiss the event as a simple case of mistaken identity. For Mason, the interviews and questions were exhausting, but he understood why they mattered. In a quiet moment, after the cameras were packed away, he told his mother, "If they figure out why it happened, maybe it won't happen to someone else." Rachel squeezed his hand again, both proud and pained by his words. Mason was no longer just a boy who had survived an encounter in the cold waters of Alaska. He had become a living witness to something shifting beneath the surface, a change in behavior that scientists, fishermen, and locals were only beginning to understand. A few mornings after Mason's account made the news, Dr. Harold Jensen and his research team set out from Seward's small harbor. The sky was overcast, the air cool enough to carry the scent of salt and seaweed, and the water stretched in a flat, slate-gray sheet. Their vessel, a modest but well-equipped research boat, moved steadily toward the deeper parts of Resurrection Bay. On deck, racks of sonar equipment and hydrophones waited to be lowered into the water. Jensen, a man who had spent decades studying the behavior of marine mammals, worked alongside his crew as they set up the instruments. Once the hydrophones were in place, the rhythmic ping of sonar began to echo through the speakers. The data appeared on a monitor in the cabin, a shifting landscape of underwater shapes and moving signatures. Then, they heard it, a distinct series of calls and clicks. Jensen's trained ear caught it immediately. "That's a solitary male," he told the team, leaning closer to the screen, "and he's staying close to shore." His tone carried both curiosity and unease. Orcas, especially adult males, were rarely alone for long periods, particularly during the summer salmon runs. Normally, they traveled in pods, their movements tied closely to the migration of fish. Jensen recorded the data, marking the animal's path as it traced the edges of the bay. The readings showed a consistent pattern, the same orca moving in and out of shallow areas near known swimming spots. "This behavior is unusual," he explained. "A lone orca approaching human activity zones isn't typical. It's a warning sign." Back on shore, James Holloway reviewed the incoming reports. The information added weight to his growing suspicion that this wasn't just random. In recent years, large-scale commercial salmon fishing had significantly reduced the availability of prey in local waters. With less food in their usual hunting grounds, predators could be forced to adapt, and in some cases, that meant venturing into areas they would normally avoid. While the team continued tracking, the orca's presence remained an unspoken tension in the bay. Fishermen reported seeing a tall dorsal fin gliding silently alongside their boats, sometimes close enough to see the white patches above its eyes. Jensen listened to these accounts carefully, noting how often the sightings involved small vessels or areas where fish were being cleaned and discarded into the water. Beneath the blue-green surface, the solitary male kept moving, a dark, streamlined shadow that blended into the deeper water before reappearing near the sunlight above, whether it was hunger, curiosity, or something else entirely. Its behavior suggested intent, the kind that made scientists and locals alike wonder if Mason's encounter had been only the first. The attack had become more than just a headline. It was now the subject of heated conversations in coffee shops, on fishing docks, and in the aisles of the local grocery store. It didn't take long before the Seward Community Center announced an open meeting to address the incident. By the evening of the gathering, the room was filled beyond capacity, folding chairs lined the back wall, and latecomers stood shoulder to shoulder along the entrance. Local fishermen, environmental advocates, residents, and members of the press mingled in a low buzz of anticipation. At the front of the room, a simple podium stood beneath a banner that read, "Community Forum Protecting Our Bay." The air smelled faintly of rain-soaked coats and freshly brewed coffee from the lobby. When it was her turn to speak, Linda Moretti stepped up to the microphone. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edges of the podium. She began by describing the moment she saw Mason in the water, her voice soft but clear. "I knew something was wrong the second I saw that fin," she said, pausing briefly to steady herself. "When I called Marine Rescue, I didn't know if help would come in time. I still don't know how they made it so fast." Her words drew quiet nods from the audience. though the unease in her tone was unmistakable. Next came a representative from the conservation group, Save Our Seas. Dressed in a simple blue windbreaker, she spoke with urgency about the larger implications. "This is not just about one boy and one whale," she said. "The habitats of apex predators are being disrupted worldwide, and Alaska is no exception. We cannot ignore the role human activity plays in driving animals closer to our shores." Her remarks sparked murmurs that quickly grew into sharper exchanges. Several fishermen voiced their concerns, arguing that proposed restrictions on salmon fishing would devastate the local economy. One man stood and said, "We've been fishing these waters for generations. If you shut us down, you're not just protecting whales, you're killing our town." The debate stretched on, voices overlapping as frustration bubbled beneath the surface. Some spoke passionately about conservation, others about survival, each convinced their side was the one protecting Seward's future. Toward the back of the room, Mason sat quietly with his mother. His face was calm, almost expressionless, but his eyes moved from speaker to speaker, absorbing every word. Around him, people argued about the event that had nearly ended his life, and yet no one seemed to have an answer that would make it impossible for it to happen again. By the time the meeting adjourned, no agreement had been reached. The crowd filtered out into the damp evening air, conversations still spilling into the street. But one question lingered, unspoken, yet heavy in the minds of everyone there. In a world where human and wild lives intersect, which should we protect first? 2 weeks after the attack, Mason was released from the hospital. The wounds on his arm had started to heal, though the scars were still tender to the touch. His mother suggested they take a quiet drive to Resurrection Bay, the place where everything had changed. The afternoon sky was clear, and the air carried the cool freshness that only came from the ocean. When they arrived, the bay looked calm again. The water rippled gently under the sunlight. Gulls drifted overhead, and the moss-covered rocks sat undisturbed along the shoreline. To anyone else, it might have seemed peaceful, but for Mason, the sight was different now. He stood at the water's edge and stared out over the expanse, his mind replaying flashes of dark water and unblinking eyes. It was the same bay, but it no longer felt harmless. Around the same time, James Holloway finalized his investigation report. His findings were clear. The attack had been carried out by a solitary adult male orca, whose behavior suggested a significant shift from the norm. The most likely cause, he concluded, was a reduction in natural prey, driven in part by human activity. The statement was detailed but direct. This was not an accident without explanation. Dr. Harold Jensen's comments accompanied the report. "When the food chain is broken," he said, "the line between humans and predators will disappear." His words quickly spread beyond Seward, picked up by newspapers, online articles, and even national news broadcasts. To some, it was a scientific observation. To others, it was a warning. Environmental organizations seized the moment to push for immediate changes. They called for the restoration of marine ecosystems, stricter fishing quotas, and protections for salmon spawning areas. Their message was straightforward: if the sea's balance continued to shift, encounters like Mason's would not remain rare. In response, Alaska's state government began reviewing commercial fishing limits during peak seasons. The proposals faced pushback from some industries, but the conversation had begun, and it was no longer just about economics. It was about coexistence with a wild system that humans had never truly controlled. As for Mason, returning home meant adjusting to a new normal. The nightmares came less often as the weeks passed, but the memory stayed vivid. Friends and neighbors asked about the attack, and he would tell them not to shock them, but because the story was now part of who he was. He spoke not only about the fear, but also about the feeling of being in the water with something so powerful, something that belonged entirely to the ocean. Standing on the shoreline that day, Mason realized that the sea would always hold its beauty, shimmering waves, crisp air, and endless horizons. But beneath it all, there was a raw, untamed force. And no matter how much humans thought they understood it, some parts of the ocean were never meant to be touched. The events in Resurrection Bay were more than a rare and frightening encounter. They were a reminder that the ocean is not ours to control. Mason's survival was a stroke of luck, but the deeper story lies in why it happened at all. A single orca's change in behavior reflected something bigger. The delicate balance of the marine ecosystem is shifting, and human activity plays a part in that change. When food chains collapse, predators adapt, and sometimes that adaptation brings them right to our shores. It's a warning that coexistence with the wild requires more than admiration, it demands responsibility. We can't expect the sea to remain unchanged if we continue to take from it without giving anything back. If stories like this resonate with you, help keep the conversation alive. Like, share, and subscribe so more people can see the reality of what happens when the wild and human worlds collide and what it will take to protect both.